August 19th, 1942. Dieppe's cliffs. A single flash of engineered glass turned the tide of what should have been a massacre. Before dawn broke over the English Channel, 19 Kriegsmarine guards abandoned their concrete fortress without firing a shot. The weapon wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a bullet. It was something the Germans never anticipated. American ingenuity forged in a Baltimore laboratory, carried across the Atlantic by a man who refused to accept that good soldiers had to die for bad intelligence. June 12, 1942, 0340 hours. Combined Operations Headquarters, Richmond Terrace, London. The room smelled of burnt coffee and anxious sweat. Rain hammered against blacked-out windows, while Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten spread reconnaissance photographs across the mahogany table. Each image showed the same nightmare. Dieppe's chalk cliffs crowned with reinforced concrete bunkers, German MG-42 machine guns commanding every approach, overlapping fields of fire that turned the beaches into killing zones. "Gentlemen, we have a catastrophic problem," Mountbatten said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 previous cancelled operations. Intelligence estimates 850 German defenders in hardened positions. Our assault force, 6,000 Canadians and British commandos, will hit those beaches in 67 days. Current projections, 42% casualties in the first wave alone. Captain James Keller of the U.S. Army Rangers stood at the back of the room, his Iowa farm boy frame rigid with controlled frustration. At 29, he'd volunteered for the 1st American Commando unit specifically because he was tired of watching men die for failures of imagination. He'd seen it in North Africa. He'd seen it in training exercises where doctrine trumped common sense. "With respect, sir," Keller interrupted, his Midwestern accent cutting through the British formality, "we're planning to assault fortified positions in broad daylight without addressing the fundamental problem. Those bunkers are immune to preliminary bombardment, and the Germans will see us coming from 5 miles out." A British colonel bristled. "Captain, the plan has been approved at the highest. The plan is going to kill 3,000 men," Keller said flatly, "because we're treating this like Gallipoli with better radios. What we need is a way to neutralize those bunkers without alerting the entire Atlantic Wall." The silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was the institutional exhaustion of military bureaucracy confronted with an uncomfortable truth. Mountbatten studied Keller with the calculating expression of a commander who'd authorized too many coffin telegrams. "You have an alternative, Captain?" "I have the beginning of one, sir. Before I enlisted, I worked with Dr. Harold Edgerton at MIT. High-speed photography, stroboscopic research. 6 months ago, I corresponded with a colleague at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Samuel Prescott, about a theoretical application, using precisely calibrated light pulses to create directional signals invisible to peripheral observers but overwhelming at point-blank range. Fancy flashlights. The British colonel's skepticism dripped like acid. "Psychological warfare, weaponized through optical physics," Keller corrected. "The Germans train their coastal defenders to watch for conventional threats: aircraft, naval bombardment, infantry assault. They're not prepared for a threat that exists in a wavelength outside standard military doctrine. We could create a device that exploits that blind spot." Mountbatten leaned forward. "How long would development take? Conventional channels? 6 months, maybe 9, by which time Operation Jubilee proceeds as planned and we fill 3,000 body bags." Keller pulled a folded schematic from his jacket, creased from weeks in his pocket. "Or you give me authorization to circumvent standard procurement procedures, direct access to American industrial facilities, and 60 days. I'll build something that makes those bunkers surrender before the first landing craft hits the beach." The proposal violated 18 separate regulations. It contradicted established doctrine about siege warfare. It required placing enormous trust in an unproven American captain with a background in academic research rather than combat operations. Statistics supported Keller's urgency. In the Great War, frontal assaults against prepared defensive positions produced casualty rates averaging 63%. Modern coastal defenses had only increased that lethality. The German MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of Allied machine guns. Dieppe's bunkers were positioned with Teutonic precision to create interlocking kill zones where attacking forces would be caught in crossfire with no cover. "You understand," Mountbatten said slowly, "that if this fails, you'll be held personally responsible for diverting war resources during a material crisis." "Sir, I'm already responsible for every man who dies because we didn't try." Keller's voice carried no bravado, only the quiet certainty of someone who'd calculated the moral mathematics. "My hometown in Iowa sent 42 men to this war. 19 are already dead because we keep sending good people to die in bad plans. I'm not asking permission to fail safely. I'm asking permission to succeed dangerously." The British colonel stood. "This is insanity. We don't even know if—" "Approved," Mountbatten cut him off. "Captain Keller, you have 60 days and whatever resources the combined operations budget can legally divert. Fail, and I'll have you court-martialed. Succeed, and I'll personally recommend you for Commando training with No. 4 Commando. They're the unit assigned to neutralize the Hesse battery on Dieppe's western headland." Keller's hand remained steady as he saluted, but his mind was already calculating. 60 days to design, prototype, test, and deploy a technology that existed only in theoretical physics journals. 60 days to convince skeptical military officials that a farm boy from Cedar Rapids understood optical warfare better than career officers. 60 days to build something that would either save thousands of lives or prove that desperation made people believe in miracles. June 13th, 1942, Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Maryland. The telegram reached Dr. Samuel Prescott at 09:20 hours. "Urgent stop optical research project requires immediate collaboration. Stop military authorization. Highest level. Stop Keller." Prescott, 53 years old with hands permanently stained from photochemical work, read the message 3 times. He'd known James Keller as a brilliant undergraduate who'd abandoned academic research to enlist after Pearl Harbor, a decision Prescott had considered wasteful of extraordinary talent. The phone call that followed contained exactly 8 minutes of technical discussion before Prescott interrupted. "You're describing a coherent light amplification system that won't be theoretically possible for another decade." "Then we'll build the impossible," Keller said, long-distance static crackling over the line, "because the alternative is acceptable casualties, and I'm done accepting that arithmetic." "James, even if we could generate the intensity you're describing, the power requirements—" "I've already contacted Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. They're fabricating a portable generator based on turbine designs from Boeing. It'll weigh 60 pounds and produce 1,200 watts for 45 seconds, enough for 3 full-intensity pulses." Prescott sat down heavily. The technical audacity was staggering, but more unsettling was the realization that Keller had already begun constructing something that respected physics professors insisted couldn't exist. "What do you need from me?" "Glass," Keller said simply. "Specifically, I need you to develop an optical lens system that can focus incoherent light into a beam with less than 2 degrees of dispersion at 500 yards. The military specifications are that it needs to be soldier portable, impact-resistant, and capable of producing a visible effect intense enough to induce temporary visual disorientation." "You're describing a weaponized lighthouse. I'm describing the difference between a massacre and a victory." June 20th, 1942. Westinghouse Research Facility, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The factory floor operated under wartime urgency that blurred day into night into day again. Engineers worked 18-hour shifts, sleeping on cots between machines that stamped out components for a device most of them didn't fully understand. The project had been classified under Emergency Authorization ZX-47, which meant civilians asked no questions and military observers took notes without explanations. James Keller stood in the center of organized chaos. His uniform jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, hands burned from handling prototype components still hot from the forge. Around him, the apparatus was taking shape. A generator cobbled from aircraft turbine parts, capacitor arrays designed for radio transmitters, and at the heart of it all, Dr. Prescott's optical assembly, 17 pounds of precisely ground glass that could focus scattered light into something approaching a weapon. "It's not going to work," said Lieutenant Charles Hammond, the British liaison officer assigned to observe American ingenuity or document American failure. "Even if you achieve the intensity you're claiming, human psychology doesn't support your hypothesis. Soldiers under fire don't surrender because of bright lights." Keller didn't look up from the oscilloscope measuring voltage fluctuations. "Soldiers under fire react to threats they've been trained to recognize. We're creating something outside their doctrine. The psychological effect isn't about brightness. It's about confronting something their training never prepared them to handle." The technical challenges were multiplying faster than solutions. The generator overheated after 38 seconds, 6 seconds short of minimum operational requirement. The capacitors discharged unevenly, creating a pulse pattern that resembled a strobe rather than the steady, overwhelming beam Keller had designed. And the glass, Prescott's magnificent optical assembly, had cracked during the third test, requiring complete refabrication with a more heat-resistant formula. July 3, 1942, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The first field test was conducted before an audience of skeptical observers. 2 British commandos, 4 American Rangers, a representative from the Office of Strategic Services, and a medical officer there to document injuries when the device inevitably exploded. The target was a reinforced concrete pillbox, identical to German coastal defenses, positioned 500 yards from the apparatus. Inside, volunteers wearing standard-issue sunglasses would simulate defenders reacting to the light pulse. Keller checked connections for the 19th time, aware that every pair of eyes watching him represented institutional doubt. In the military, innovation was tolerated only after conventional methods failed so catastrophically that alternatives became unavoidable. He was asking them to trust the unconventional before the conventional had been attempted. "Generator to full power," he called out. The turbine whined, climbing through frequencies until it stabilized at a pitch that made teeth ache. Capacitors charged with a rising electrical hum. Keller positioned himself behind the optical assembly, hands on the trigger mechanism he'd adapted from a camera shutter. Ironic, given his background in photography. Firing in 3, 2, 1. The release was instantaneous. 17 pounds of precision glass focused 1200 watts into a beam that struck the pillbox, with the visual intensity of concentrated sunlight compressed into a weapon. The pulse lasted 4 seconds, long enough to overwhelm human visual adaptation, short enough to avoid permanent damage. Silence followed. Then, from inside the pillbox, shouting. The door burst open and volunteers stumbled out, ripping off their sunglasses, hands pressed against their eyes. "I couldn't see anything," one gasped. "It was like staring at the sun, except it was everywhere, bouncing off the concrete, filling the entire bunker. I couldn't tell where the walls were. I couldn't tell where the door was. All I could think was, get out, get out, get out." The medical officer examined them. Temporary photokeratitis, no permanent damage, visual function returning within 12 minutes. But the psychological effect was undeniable. Trained soldiers, knowing the test was coming, prepared with protective eyewear, had still fled their defensive position. Lieutenant Hammond approached Keller, his skepticism replaced by something approaching respect. "You've built something genuinely horrifying. The question is whether it works under combat conditions when people are shooting back. That's what the next 47 days are for," Keller said, already mentally cataloguing improvements. The generator needed better cooling. The capacitors needed more consistent discharge. and they needed to build 6 more units because military operations required redundancy. July 28, 1942. Baltimore Fabrication Facility. The production phase revealed American industrial capacity operating at impossible speed. Westinghouse committed a production line exclusively to generators. Corning Glass assigned 14 specialists to fabricate optical assemblies under Prescott's obsessive supervision. The capacitor arrays were being assembled by women recruited from radio manufacturing plants, Rosie the riveters, repurposed for electronic warfare. But the pressure was destroying people. Prescott had lost 15 pounds, subsisting on coffee and conviction. Engineers were making errors from exhaustion, a wiring mistake that ruined 2 weeks of capacitor work, a measurement error that shattered an optical assembly worth $3,000. Keller himself was operating on 4 hours of sleep per night, knowing that every hour wasted was another opportunity for the operation to proceed without his device, condemning men to die in a doctrine-driven massacre. "You're going to kill yourself before the device ever reaches combat," Prescott said during one midnight session, watching Keller hand-polish glass components because he didn't trust anyone else's precision. "Then I'll die having tried," Keller said simply, "which is more than I can say if I rest comfortably while good men die preventably." The final prototype weighed 64 pounds fully loaded, portable, barely. The generator could sustain 3 pulses before requiring a 15-minute cooldown. The effective range was 480 yards under ideal conditions, and it required 2 operators, one managing the generator, one aiming the optical assembly. It was imperfect, it was unprecedented, and on August 12, 1942, 7 days before Operation Jubilee, it was loaded onto a transport ship bound for England. August 17, 1942, Number 4 Commando Staging Area, Portsmouth, England. The commandos, assigned to destroy the Hesse battery, regarded the device with the suspicion soldiers reserve for untested equipment that might kill them faster than the enemy. The optical apparatus looked like something between a searchlight and a photographer's camera, enlarged to nightmare proportions. The generator resembled an aircraft engine that had mated with a lawnmower. "You want us to carry this up a cliff under fire," said Major Derek Mills Roberts, commanding No. 4 Commando, "and then shine a light at Germans, who will be shooting at us with actual weapons. The device neutralizes defensive positions without alerting surrounding forces," Keller explained for the 6th time, his patience eroding. "Conventional assault creates noise, gunfire, explosions, that notifies every German within 3 miles. This is silent psychological warfare. Psychological warfare that requires us to get within 500 yards of machine guns, which you were planning to do anyway, except now you won't have to fight through 19 Kriegsmarine guards to reach the battery." The rehearsal was conducted on the night of August 17th against a mock-up of the Hesse battery position. British commandos approached through simulated darkness, while the optical device was positioned at the designated assault point. When the generator reached operational power, Keller fired a 3-second pulse at the mock bunker. The effect, even in rehearsal, was unsettling. The concentrated light didn't simply illuminate, it disoriented. Soldiers in the target structure reported complete loss of spatial awareness, an overwhelming instinct to flee the enclosed space where the light seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. "It's not just bright," one commando reported. "It's psychologically wrong. Your brain can't process it. Every instinct screams that you're in danger, that the structure is collapsing, that you need to evacuate immediately." August 19, 1942. 0430 hours. Approaching Dieppe, English Channel. The landing craft cut through 4-foot swells, the channel's cold spray soaking commandos already weighted with equipment. Keller crouched in Landing Craft Assault 187, the optical device secured in waterproof wrapping, the generator strapped to Corporal Ben Fisher from Detroit, a former Ford assembly line worker who'd volunteered because, if some Iowa farm boy can build this crazy thing, a Michigan factory man can carry it. Intelligence had confirmed the Hesse battery was defended by 19 Kriegsmarine coastal artillery specialists, highly trained, well-equipped, occupying a reinforced position that dominated the western approach to Dieppe. Conventional assault estimates gave No. 4 Commando a 37% chance of success, with expected casualties of 40%. At 4:47 hours, the landing craft grounded on rocks beneath the cliffs. Commandos moved with practiced silence, beginning the ascent through paths reconnoitered from aerial photographs. Keller and Fisher followed, the generator's 64 pounds a brutal burden on the steep, dark climb. The Hesse battery sat 270 feet above sea level, its concrete walls 4 feet thick, firing slits oriented to cover the sea approaches. Inside, 19 men operated 4 150mm guns, capable of devastating the invasion fleet. German doctrine called for these positions to fight until relieved or destroyed. Surrender was considered dereliction, retreat was unthinkable. At 05 and 12 hours, No. 4 Commando reached the assault position, 140 yards from the battery's landward entrance. Dawn was 53 minutes away. The main Dieppe landings would begin at 5:30 hours, 18 minutes. Keller assembled the optical device with hands that had performed this sequence 200 times in training. Fisher brought the generator to operational power. The turbines whine, masked by wind and distant naval gunfire from diversionary bombardment. "Device ready," Keller whispered into the radio. "Commence," Mills-Roberts ordered. Keller aimed the optical assembly at the battery's entrance, a 3-foot-wide opening through which light would penetrate, bounce off interior concrete, and fill the enclosed space with overwhelming radiance. He pressed the trigger. The pulse struck like silent thunder. Inside the battery, chaos erupted in darkness, turned to blinding white. Kriegsmarine gunners, trained to operate in all conditions, found themselves in an environment their doctrine had never contemplated. The light wasn't just bright, it was architecturally impossible, seeming to emanate from the concrete itself, destroying depth perception, eliminating shadows, making the enclosed space feel simultaneously infinite and claustrophobically small. Training dictated they maintain their posts. Instinct screamed to flee the impossible. 37 seconds after the pulse, the first German emerged from the entrance, hands raised not in surrender but in blind panic, stumbling into pre-dawn darkness like a man escaping a burning building. Others followed. 19 men, abandoning their posts without firing a shot, surrendering to commandos they couldn't see because their visual adaptation was destroyed, because their training had prepared them for every threat, except one that existed outside military physics. No. 4, Commando secured the battery at 0519 hours, 11 minutes before the main landing. The 19 Kriegsmarine prisoners were secured, their artillery pieces demolished with explosives. When dawn broke at 6:05 hours, the Hesse battery that should have devastated the invasion fleet was silent. German Coastal Defense Command, Dieppe, 0547 hours. Oberst Hermann Bartelt studied the operations map with growing confusion. Radio contact with the Hesse battery had ceased at 0514 hours, standard communication disruption during combat. But reports from forward observers made no sense. The battery had gone silent, without sustained firefight, without artillery duel, without the noise signature that accompanied its destruction. "Was it naval gunfire?" he demanded. "No bombardment detected at that position, Herr Oberst." "Aerial attack?" "No aircraft observed in that sector." "Then how does a reinforced battery position simply cease to exist?" The question had no answer that fit German military doctrine. Positions were reduced through superior firepower, through sustained assault, through casualties that accumulated until defensive capabilities collapsed. They did not simply vanish in silence. Later, examination of the prisoners revealed even more disturbing data. The Kriegsmarine gunners, elite coastal defenders, reported a weapon that existed outside the catalogue of Allied capabilities. A light that attacked consciousness rather than bodies, that made enclosed defensive positions into psychological traps. German intelligence attempted to classify the weapon: experimental searchlight technology, chemical agent producing hallucinations, some form of electrical attack. Every explanation failed because the prisoners' descriptions were consistent. They had been driven from their position not by fear of death, but by overwhelming sensory disorientation that made defense psychologically impossible. The Americans had introduced a weapon that German doctrine couldn't counter because German training assumed warfare operated within established parameters. This existed somewhere else entirely. August 21st, 1942. Portsmouth, England. The butcher's bill from Operation Jubilee was catastrophic. Of the 6,000 Allied troops committed, 3,369 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The main landings had encountered the exact massacre Keller had warned about. Machine gun fire, devastating infantry trapped on open beaches, armored support bogged in shingle, tactical communications collapsing under chaos. But the western flank, no. 4 Commandos' assault on the Hesse battery had succeeded with exactly 0 fatalities. The contrast was so stark that initial reports were questioned. A military operation in 1942 simply didn't produce outcomes where one assault element suffered 56% casualties, while another, attacking an equally fortified position, suffered none. Captain James Keller sat in the debriefing room while senior officers dissected his innovation with the enthusiasm of generals who'd glimpsed a future where doctrine required fundamental revision. The psychological effect exceeded all projections, an intelligence analyst reported. German prisoners from the battery consistently described disorientation so severe they believed the structure itself was threatening collapse. This wasn't rational fear. It was instinctive panic triggered by sensory overload. Vice Admiral Mountbatten studied the schematic of the optical device. Can it be replicated for other operations? The 7 prototypes still exist, Keller said carefully. But replication requires specialized fabrication facilities, components that are in high demand for other war production, and most critically, operators who understand that this isn't a conventional weapon. It requires different tactical thinking. What Keller didn't say, but everyone in the room understood, was that the device's success contradicted 50 years of military doctrine about siege warfare. It suggested that future conflicts might be decided not by who had more firepower, but by who could innovate beyond established physics. December 1943. Office of Strategic Services, Washington, D.C. The optical device never saw widespread deployment. The technical demands were too specialized, the training too extensive, the tactical applications too narrow, but its implications rippled through American military planning like a stone dropped in still water. Dr. Samuel Prescott received a discreet visit from government officials interested in his optical research. Could similar principles apply to other applications? Could focused light be used for communication that was undetectable to conventional interception? Could it serve as navigation aid, as targeting system, as foundation for entirely new categories of technology? The questions were classified. The research that followed was conducted at facilities that didn't officially exist, funded by budgets buried in other appropriations. April 1975. Declassification Review, National Archives. The official file labeled Operation Jubilee Ancillary Equipment Field Test ZX-47 was released to researchers after 33 years of classification. Historians examining the Dieppe raid discovered a footnote to catastrophe, a single experimental device that had saved 19 lives by not taking 19 others. Dr. James Keller, by then a 62-year-old professor of physics at Stanford University, received a phone call from a graduate student researching unconventional weapons. "Sir, were you aware your device is considered a foundational precedent for non-lethal warfare doctrine?" Keller, who'd spent 3 decades teaching undergraduates about photonic principles, paused before answering. I was aware that 19 German sailors went home to their families because we found a better way. That's the only precedent that mattered to me. The numbers told their own story. Number 4. Commando. 252 men committed, 0 fatalities. Mission objective achieved in 18 minutes. Main Dieppe landings. 5,148 men committed, 1,027 killed. Mission objectives failed within 3 hours. The western flank succeeded not because of superior courage or training, but because one Iowa farm boy refused to accept that good tactics required bad casualties. The optical device itself was never mass-produced. The prototypes were stored in military warehouses, eventually destroyed when their components degraded beyond repair. But the concept survived, that warfare could be waged in dimensions beyond kinetic force, that technology could target psychology rather than bodies, that American innovation wasn't just about building bigger weapons, but about building smarter ones. June 6, 1994, D-Day 50th anniversary, Normandy American Cemetery. Among the veterans attending the commemoration was Derek Mills Roberts, 83 years old, moving slowly but still carrying the bearing of a commando officer. A journalist asked him about the lessons of Dieppe that informed the successful Normandy invasion 2 years later. "We learned that assaulting prepared defenses requires more than courage," Mills Roberts said. "It requires innovation that makes the defense's preparation irrelevant." There was an American captain, James Keller, who understood that before the rest of us. He built something that saved lives by not taking them. That's victory in its purest form. The journalist pressed for details about the device. Mills Roberts smiled. "It was classified for decades, so I can tell you now, it was a light, just a light, but concentrated by American know-how into something that made good men question their orders, that made defense psychologically impossible. The Germans at Hesse Battery didn't surrender because they were beaten. They surrendered because Keller built something that existed outside their understanding of warfare. And the legacy lived on in places few recognized. Non-lethal weapons programs that prioritize psychological effect over physical damage. Optical systems used in crowd control, in hostage situations, in scenarios where traditional force would cause unacceptable casualties. The principle that American military superiority wasn't measured solely by destructive capacity, but by intellectual capacity to operate outside adversarial doctrine. And in a basement archive at Stanford University, a schematic drawn in June 1942 by a farm boy from Iowa, who believed that innovation measured in character counts and glass precision could matter more than artillery that measured in caliber and explosive yield. The title on the schematic, written in Keller's careful engineering notation, "Optical Displacement System, because better ideas should replace acceptable casualties." 19 German sailors returned to their families in 1942 because one American refused to accept that their deaths were militarily necessary. That refusal, translated into physics and fabricated in Pittsburgh factories, became the foundational argument that warfare could evolve beyond the arithmetic of attrition. In the archives of forgotten innovations, among the technologies that changed history without becoming legendary, the optical displacement system remained, proof that the most devastating weapons are sometimes those that refuse to kill, built by people who refuse to accept that death is the only currency of victory. If this story of American ingenuity under impossible pressure moved you, hit that subscribe button and join a community that values the untold narratives of World War II. Drop a comment sharing which aspect of this operation shocked you most. Was it the audacity of the technology, the silent surrender, or the fact that one man's refusal to accept casualties changed tactical doctrine? Let's keep these forgotten heroes' stories alive. New episodes every week, exploring the innovations that won the war behind the battles everyone remembers.